speaker series. Try to say that fast. Just a few announcements. First of all, I'm Jeff Lurie. I'm the Vice President of the Bethlehem Historical Association. And first and foremost, I'd like to thank the library for partnering with us on our speaker series. We truly appreciate this partnership. Next up, on November 20th, John Palmer, Greene County historian, will be speaking on the surprisingly riveting history of the humble hay press, a significant innovation for Bethlehem's farmers, as well as those of Greene County. As a reminder, our museum at the Cedar Hill Schoolhouse is open Sunday afternoons through the end of October, 2 p.m. to 4 p.m., so just a few more chances to visit us this season. This Sunday, our outbuildings, including the tollgate, carriage house, and privy, will be open too. Our Election Day bake sale is coming up November 5th. You don't have to be a voter to stop by the schoolhouse to pick up some yummy bake treats. Also, see me if you'd like to donate a baked good. I promise it'll get to the bake sale. And now on to our speaker, Jill Knapp, who will be sharing the story of the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad and the war for its control. Jill Knapp received a BS degree in general agriculture from Cornell and an MS and PhD in agronomy from Purdue, where her research focused on wheat production. Jill was horticulturist at Hancock Shaker Village and had been director of conservation districts of Iowa. She was also agricultural program leader at Cornell Cooperative Extension of Orange County and adjunct professor at Ramapo, New Jersey. From 2005 to 2013, Jill was also executive director of the Hudson Mohawk Land Conservatory. She authored the book, The Time for Redemption, about the anti-rent wars of the early 1800s. Please help me welcome Jill Knapp.
Better? All right, good, thank you. All right. Well, the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad, many of you may not realize it actually ran right through here, Delmar. Most people now are very familiar with the Delaware and Hudson, but before it was the Delaware and Hudson, a section of it was the Albany and Susquehanna. So that's the story we're going to talk about tonight. Let's see. Okay. If I can find my, all right. By 1850, much of the state was encompassed by canals and railroads that, got produce and things throughout the state pretty well. But there was one region that was really lacking much transportation. And this was an area of about 3,500 square miles that ran southwest from Albany down to Binghamton. And it was recalled as the sequestered district because it was so shut off from any other transportation. Okay. Why is this not going? All right, this seems to want to be moving here. The mouse doesn't seem to be working. Help. Is there any technical help back there? My mouse doesn't seem to be working. Let's see. All right, so what is...
so it's just a click.
Click on the left click?
Yeah.
All right,
Click.
all right.
I thought this would work. I guess it doesn't.
Technical difficulties here. All right. This is a map of 1862, and it shows both the canals and the railroads. The red line was the route for the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad. Obviously, by 1862, it had already been proposed and was pretty well established. But you can see it was a fairly broad area there down through Schoharie and Delaware counties that really, until that was installed, really had not much link to the rest of the state. was considered that a journey to Albany back in those days with a load of produce was as much of an event as importance that required an elaborate preparation as a journey to Omaha, Nebraska does today. And that was written by H.T. Dana in 1903. So it was an arduous trip. The Albany and Susquehanna Road was organized in 1851, was to run from Albany to Binghamton, and it would connect with the New York and Erie railroads down in Binghamton. It was largely envisioned to bring agricultural products to urban markets in the Albany area, but it was also thought as a way to bring cheaper coal to Albany and New England. Today, it roughly parallels I-88 and Route 9, and it goes through a lot of really small towns and farmland. It's really a beautiful drive if you ever want to take it. It took me, trying to find some of these little towns, it took me about 4 hours, believe it or not, to go from Albany down to Oneonta, which you can probably do in an hour and a half if you're on I-88. But going the back roads, which was much more scenic, it was quite a job. The A&S requested $1 million in bonds from Albany Common Council. They had thought that it would bring a lot of benefits to the city of Albany. There would be constructions of depots and engine houses, construction of locomotives and cars, and it would open the market of the state possessed of more agricultural wealth than any in the state. When the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad, the Albany Northern Railroad, and this great road shall have been completed, Albany will truly be the great railroad center of the East. Its preeminence will be undisputed, and that was written in 1852. Apparently, the Albany Common Council believed this, and it was approved by a vote of 6,061 to 1,427. So the public bought into this, that it was going to really help Albany. But progress was really quite slow. In 1855, the Otsego County Agricultural Society was still waiting for much to happen. Otsego County is inland and isolated, touching no points on any canal or navigable waters, and not even with 15 miles of a railroad at its nearest point. They really needed a market for their 4.5 million pounds of butter and cheese and their 1.5 million pounds of hops, which were famous for both their quality and quantity in the U.S. and Europe. And this area was well known for its hops. I mean, if you ever go down and visit the little railroad museum down there in Schoharie, they do have some exhibits on the hops. It was such an important crop for the region. Mr. Joseph H. Ramsey of Cobleskill, he took up the cause. He had been born in Sharon, Schoharie County, on January 29, 1816. In 1855, he introduced a bill into the legislature that would permit towns to subscribe funding for the railroad. It was defeated in the state Senate. He tried again in 1856. The bill would enable the citizens of towns who requested it to aid in the constructing the road, thereby beyond all doubt benefiting themselves, and not, as the opponents of the measure contended, involving themselves irretrievably in debt. The idea did not conflict with a single provision of the Constitution. He asked, if highways and canals receive public funding, why not railroads? He replied was the answer that canals were owned by the state. And he believed that if the town supported the railroad, it will then emphatically be the people's road and be owned and controlled by them. But due to lack of funding, little had been done since 1854. They had acquired most of the right-of-way. They had graded about 25 miles. They'd paid for depot sites. But the big question was, did the company have the means to complete the road? And that was a question those opposed to funding wanted to know. Mr. Ramsey's response to this was, all I ask is to let this matter go to the people. If they decide against aiding the project, with that decision I shall be content. A bill passed the 79th session of the legislature in 1856, which authorized any town in the county of Schenectady, Schoharie, Otsego, Delaware, Shenango, or Broome to subscribe to the capital stock of the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad Company. And what I thought was interesting about this was Albany was not included, because it started in Albany, it ran all the way out through Altamont, but Albany was not included in this. But progress was still slow, and so frustrated by the lack of progress that Mr. Dana wrote a poem in 1856. This is just a portion of it. It was much longer, but they bring progression on its way and usher in a brighter day. Then why should we not have one too? It would for us the same thing do. Here where nature has done much, but art scarce felt us with its touch. Our lands are rich, our crops are fair, our herds are fat, and yet here we are. With our old and rusty shell, in blissful nothingness we dwell. But build the railroad and we'll claim a better fate, a brighter name. Well, Mr. Ramsey continued to introduce legislation for state funding. He asked for $1 million in 1860, and it was vetoed. Again, 1861, he thought, well, I'll try for $500,000. Maybe that will be a little, more manageable. Governor Morgan vetoed it. He claimed the bill had not gotten the required constitutionally 2/3 majority in both houses. Again, 1862, he asked for $500,000 and the governor vetoed it. Again, 1863, he was stubborn. One half to be paid after the completion of 40 miles and the rest after 80 miles were done. This was opposed by Senator Tobey, but he commented, yet he did not know, but it would be better to pay the money and be quit of the claim, for undoubtedly by the indomitable perseverance and energy of the senator from the 14th district, Mr. Ramsey, it would eventually become a law and the appropriation be made. It did finally pass on April 3rd, 1863. But the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad first must spend $1 million of its own money and complete 40 miles before it could receive the first $250,000. The rest of the money would be reached after 40 more miles had been completed to Oneonta. Finally, September 15th, 1863, the line was opened between Albany and Central Bridge in Schoharie County. 2 excursion engines consisting of 4 passenger cars and 4 freight cars, conveniently fitted up with seats and drawn by 2 powerful engines, the E.R. Ford and the E.P. Prentice, left the depot at the corner of Lydius and Church Streets at a little after 9 a.m. They arrived at Central Bridge about 1 p.m., and State Comptroller Robinson assured the crowd he would, with the greatest cheerfulness, pay out the $500,000 appropriated. And this is what it looks like today. It's not much to see, honestly. This is at the junction where some of the short lines and the Albany and Schoharie met. Basically just sort of a gravelly-looking place. 2 years later, in 1865, this was the headlines in the paper. Opening of the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad to Oneonta. 82 miles from Albany, only 58 more to complete the road. A grand excursion. One of the greatest excursions that has ever taken place from our city occurred yesterday on the occasion of the opening of the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad to Oneonta. And with that much completed, there were some short lines built. These were very short. I think one was like 4 miles. But with the line completed at Central Bridge, the 1867, the Middleburg and Schoharie railroads were connected to the A&S at Schoharie Junction. And this is the Railroad Museum down there. It's really a nice little place if you want to go down and visit. Some nice exhibits. A nice afternoon drive on a Sunday afternoon. But funding continued to be a problem. A bill was introduced in the legislature in 1866 for another $500,000 to finish the road, and this was vetoed by Governor Fenton. He did not believe it was in the state's best interest to add to the tax burden. Now remember, 1866 was right at the end of the Civil War, and so there were a lot of bills coming in from soldiers that had been released and payments for the war. And you know, like we're all complaining about today, taxes were high, so he didn't want to add more to that. He felt that the funding should come what he called enlightened capitalists. Ramsey, on the other hand, believed that the benefits outweighed the expense. Well, interesting in the same column of the newspaper as his veto was this article about building a brand new opera house in New York City. Now, right now you won't say, well, what the heck was the connection? But you'll see that there really was a connection for this. Pike's new opera house, now projected, will probably be the most tasteful and ornamental edifice in this city, if not on the continent. The front on 8th Avenue will be 115 feet, and the lot extends 325 feet on 23rd and 24th Streets. So this was in New York City. In 1867, $500,000 was appropriated to finish the road. It was now completed to Bainbridge. And Mr. Demers, editor of the Journal, said a word in honor of Mr. Ramsey. President Ramsey, the little giant, who for years has held fast to the idea that this road would be a success, and to whom all the honor of the success thus far should be ascribed. He rejoiced that he was present on this festive occasion, that he had been permitted to enjoy the bountiful dinner prepared by the fair ones of Bainbridge, and referred in glowing terms to the benefit the road would be to the citizens of Shenango County. But the most difficult section was yet to be completed, and this was a 2,200-foot long tunnel through Belden Mountain. I came up Route 7 this past summer from Binghamton, and I was amazed. This really is quite a hill coming up. I was surprised, so I could see why they decided to try to tunnel through it rather than try to go over it. This was finally finished just enough for the passage of trains on December 31st, 1868. It still needed some work, but at least they could get trains through the tunnel at that point. And it officially opened on January 12, 1869. 2 trains with 1,000 passengers left Albany. Other trains left Cobleskill and Oneonta. It was a crappy day. Snow and sleet made for very slow progress, and it took the last train till 6 p.m. to reach Binghamton. Following a banquet in Binghamton, a speech was made by Mr. George Bartlett, who concluded with, "The Albany and Susquehanna Railroad may the untiring energy and perseverance which brought it into existence continue to control, guide, and shape its future destiny." Mr. Ramsey received loud and persistent applause. Well, also in 1869, we get back to why this opera house was of importance. James Fisk and Jay Gould purchased it for $800,000 shortly after the railroad was completed. They propose now, by a judicious combination of railroad and opera, to make up the shortcomings of either. No opera manager ever yet had enough money. Every opera manager would have succeeded if he had a little more money. This is what Fisk and Gould have. If a few $1 million in hand run out at any time, they have only to issue stock. Aladdin was a fool to either of these. Who would go through the laborious and disagreeable labor of rubbing an old lamp greasy, of course? Fisk and Gould were also buying up a lot of other railroads at this time. The Erie Railroad will shortly come into St. Louis on a track of its own without passing through Cincinnati. So we infer from a statement that Jay Gould and his associates will have place in the directory of the Toledo and Wabash Company. It appears probable that another grand consolidation will result, and the road now building from Akron to Toledo and from Decatur to St. Louis will give the combination control of direct routes from New York. So it was probably not at all surprising that they also had their eyes on the Albany and Susquehanna. The Albany Evening Journal, August 4th, 1869, a determined movement, thoroughly organized, was initiated some months since to wrest the control of the Susquehanna Railroad from its present management. The Fisk party just needed to control the majority of the stock to vote Ramsey out at the September's annual stockholders meetings. And several directors in the A&S formed a coalition with Jay Gould to supply the funds needed to buy the town's stock. Carpetbaggers had gone out along the A&S on July 29th. Some town commissioners sold their town's share of stock, which was legal to sell at par, but if they were selling below par, they needed approval. Mr. Ramsey, hearing of this, went out the next day, and he had found that some towns had sold their stock to the Erie party for less than he offered. It also became apparent that some of the town commissioners had received a little personal donations of up to $5,000 to sell the town's stock. So something fishy was going on. Back in Albany, both parties claimed they owned the majority of the stock. August 4th, the first injunction was served on Mr. Ramsey. Judge George G. Bernard of New York City, on behalf of the Erie, issued an injunction over 2,400 shares of stock Mr. Ramsey had sold the previous year. Ramsey, in turn, enjoined the transfer of stock from Oneonta since it had been sold for less than par and lacked the required stamp. But Fisk really had Judge Bernard in his pocket. In June, he had sent the judge 2 owls. To send a judge an owl is to signify to him only that you consider him a grave and reverent judge. On the other hand, comparisons being odious, it is not always easy to say to a judge that you consider him superior to all other judges. But how delicate a way did admirable Fisk discover for doing this difficult thing? He sent the learned judge 2 owls, as much to say, I consider your honor equal in wisdom to any 2 judges. And according to the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, these were white Rocky Mountain owls. So I don't know what you do with owls when somebody sends them. I'm assuming they were alive birds, but you know, people don't normally send me owls, so. Anyway, on August 5th, Ramsey, in turn, he started action with Judge Clute of Albany, and he did it against the Erie directors and Mr. Phelps, who was treasurer of the A&S. He claimed that the Erie directors were conspiring with Jay Gould, and this was detrimental to both the railroad and the stockholders. He claimed that the allegation of selling the 24 shares of stock was totally false, that he had sold it the previous year with unanimous approval of the board of directors. He also claimed that Judge Bernard had no jurisdiction since none of the parties lived in New York City. And the defendant, William L.M. Phelps, is hereby restrained and enjoined from obeying or complying with any directions or demands of the said other defendants with reference to the disposition and custody of the books and papers of said company, or with any future resolution or direction of a board of directors of said company until the further order of the court. This was dated August 5th. Well, on the night of August 5th, all of the record books were removed from the A&S office by the Ramsey party. They claimed, they certainly did not trust the Fisk party, and they claimed that the Erie party wanted to fix the books so that they controlled the election. But the big question then was, where were they hidden? Now, sometime later, when he was writing on this, George Ticknor Curtis, he wrote a book, An Inquiry into the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad Litigations of 1869 and Mr. David Dudley Field's connection therewith. He claimed that the books were clandestinely removed from the office of the company. They were hidden for a time in a tomb in a graveyard in Albany and were afterwards carried from place to place, remained concealed for whole months. Jonathan Herrick, who had been vice president at that time, he believed that they were in a safe in the American House Hotel in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. There was a special meeting of the board of directors on Friday morning, August 6th. Vice President Jonathan Herrick, he arrived and took the seat behind the desk. He was presented with Judge Clute's injunction. With Ramsey ousted by Judge Bernard, Herrick had been ousted by Judge Clute, and so there was no one to leave the meeting, so the meeting adjourned. The company was therefore in the hands of Mr. Phelps, the treasurer, and Mr. Van Valkenburg, who was the superintendent. Well, the Erie's next move was to go back to New York City, and they sent a telegram to Judge Bernard. Now, he was in Poughkeepsie. He had, his mother was not doing well, so he was out of town at the moment. To George G. Bernard, matters postponed by O'Gorman to Monday next. Folks at Branch all right, how is your mother? And the response was very low. Honorable G.G. Bernard, come to New York without fail tonight. Answer Care 359 West 23rd Street. And his response was, I will be there if sent by you. Now, this all translated to mean that the dispatch was sent on a pass held by James Fisk, entitling him to send dispatches free, and that the pass is numbered 550. The address, 350 West 33rd Street, was the Fisk Opera House. So he was commanding Bernard to meet him at the Opera House that night. Well, they had a meeting that night at the Opera House, and they had two objectives. The first was to get their party named as receivers of the railroad, and they specifically wanted James Fisk and Charles Corder to be named. Now, Charles Corder had been a member of the original board of directors. And the other thing they wanted to accomplish that night was to decide on board members for their September meeting. By 10 p.m. that night, the directors had signed a paper requesting that Fisk and Corder be receivers. It was later alleged that Judge Bernard opened his chambers extemporary, which meant on the spur of the moment, at 10:30 o'clock at night in the house of Josephine Mansfield Layler, in order to remove Ramsey and appoint James Fisk as the receiver. Now, Josephine was Fisk's mistress. By 10:35, the order had been signed by Judge Bernard and was back in the hands of Mr. Shearman at the Opera House, and it was given to a clerk who took the 11 p.m. train to Albany. The Erie party had selected the follow to serve on the board: Charles Corder, Jeremiah Austin, Jacob Leonard, Azo Chase, David Wilbur, Samuel North, and Alonzo Everts. These were all part of the board that had served with Ramsey in 1868. But new people to the board were Jay Gould, Joseph Bush, Hamilton Harris, who was Gould's lawyer, James Fisk Jr., James Oliver, and Walter S. Church. Colonel Church, with 5 shares of stock, was eligible to serve on the board, and he was selected to serve as president. Now, if any of you are all familiar with the anti-rent wars, Colonel Church was the one who bought out the Van Rensselaer leases and was the one that was going after all the tenants. So he had his fingers in a lot of different things. He was the grandson of Angelica Schuyler. He had flunked out of West Point after 1 semester. He had purchased Stephen Van Rensselaer III's leases from his 2 sons. He lived in high style in Albany. Most of it was on credit. He was active in Albany County Democratic politics, although originally he had been a Whig. And as one paper would later say, Mr. Church is endeavoring to ride 2 or 3 horses at the same time. In 1863, he was appointed colonel in the New York State National Guard by his old school friend, Governor Seymour, and he really fit in with Fisk's and Gould business model of acquiring the work of others. He had done nothing really to support the work of the Albany and Susquehanna, but now suddenly he should be president of it. Well, the Ramsey party made application to Judge Peckham to name receiver on Friday, August 6th, and he appointed Robert H. Prine. Now, Prine had been a member of the New York Assembly. He'd been Speaker in 1850 and 1854. He had been appointed by Lincoln as minister to Japan in 1861 to 1864. This, unfortunately, had ended in a controversy when Japan's order for warships did not arrive as promised, and he returned to New York. Mr. Prine then installed Mr. Van Valkenburg, Mr. Phelps, and Mr. Ramsey's son Wilbur as his agents. Anyway, all these receivers from both camps showed up on Saturday morning to take control of the railroad. Mr. Fisk was there with his diamond pin, but not in his usual blue coat and brass buttons. And apparently he had this uniform that you can see the picture there. They made a lot of fun of him. The regalia of his office as commander of the Sound steamers and the Grand Generalissimo of the On-Sound Railroad, which runs through fire and water along the southern tier. Now, the Erie Railroad had a lot of problems with accidents. And there was a lot of concern that if he spent less time trying to run an opera, maybe he could do a better job of keeping the railroad safe. Anyway, he was accompanied by bodyguards. One of them, evidently the ringleader of this gentlemanly escort, looked as he might serve well under Sheriff Jimmy O'Brien, Reddy the Blacksmith, or Tim Flynn, guardian of the peace and order of the polls. His name is Mangum, which, in case of any difficulty calling for the exercise of his powers, would be very appropriate. You can see there he was really pickpocket and thief and Democratic regulator. So he was part of the Tammany group that kind of, checked on things at the polling places. Well, Fisk took the chair recently occupied by Mr. Herrick, assuming that he was the receiver. He then served papers on Ramsey party from Judge Bernard and announced that he had been appointed receiver by Judge Bernard. He was informed, however, Mr. Prine had been appointed receiver, but he refused to leave the chair. He was ushered out somewhat vigorously by Mr. Van Valkenburg. At that point, Mr. Smith, who was a lawyer, he arrived on behalf of the Ramsey party, and Mr. Smith and Mr. Fisk followed with the introductory ceremonies with an argument in regard to the legality of the proceedings. Mr. Smith told Fisk that Albany was not used to exhibits of violence, and Fisk replied, "Well, I am. This is the 26th or 27th raid I've been engaged in." Fisk tried again to take over as a receiver. He had new orders from Judge Bernard directing the Albany County Sheriff to put Fisk and Corder in possession. Mr. Smith, however, noticed papers lacked the proper seal and could not arrive that fast from New York City. Another paper served on Fisk for contempt of court, rested, posted bail, and Judge Peckham would hear the case on Monday, August 9th. So Fisk at that point went back to New York City. The Albany Journal definitely was in support of Mr. Ramsey. By wresting from him the fruits of his life work and converting them to the advantage of a ring of speculators whose management of the large enterprises which have fallen into their hands has been singularly selfish, remarkably reckless, and opposed to the high principles of honor that have prevailed among businessmen, who have done more than all other influences combined to corrupt the stock market and make its operations a synonymy of trickery and chicanery. I love this picture. This was from about 1870. And notice what it says in the middle one there, fake news. So there's nothing new about fake news. One act of trickery that was set up by the Fisk party was to defame Mr. Ramsey. Now, newspapers, even today, they're not always quite accurate, although a lot better. But back then, they were really not particularly accurate with names. And they frequently had Joseph Ramsey in the paper called James Ramsey. Anyway, this was a scheme that he set up to defame him. Mr. Church goes to a man in Albany by the name of Sherman and gets him to write up to a man in Fulton County to see if he could not get this man to write to a man in Hancock County and see if a man by the names of Ramsey had not been indicted there. And then to have the answer come the whole way back to Sherman, and then he was to tell what he had heard, and then because James H. Ramsey had been indicted in Little Falls, not for forgery, Church and Company began to poison the air with the lie that James H. Ramsey had been indicted for forgery. They asked Mr. Ramsey if he had not been indicted in Delaware County and then in Fulton County, and it turns out that when they were attempting to give the impression that Joseph H. Ramsey was indicted for forgery at a time when Joseph H. Ramsey was sitting in his chair, an honored member of the Senate of the state of New York. So they were really going to great lengths to try to show that he was, dishonest. Well, anyway, the lawyers appeared before Judge Peckham on Monday. They alleged that Fisk and Corder had forcibly entered the office. Fisk's attorney denied this because he believed that they were the rightful receivers based on Judge Bernard's orders. And the court decided that they better appoint a referee to gather all the facts in this. But back in New York City, Fisk got Judge Bernard to issue a writ of assistance, and this commanded the sheriffs in all the counties along the road to put Fisk and Corder in charge of the offices and property. In Binghamton, the Erie men kidnapped Albany and Susquehanna engines. 3 were captured, but 1 escaped. The Erie party was then in possession of the Binghamton office by 2 p.m. on Monday. News of this raid reached Albany Monday afternoon. The orders were sent out to the stations to get all the rolling stock out of the reach of the raiders, and they warned of damage to the tracks at Afton. Mr. Smith, who was lawyer for the good side, not for the Fisk party, the other party, he left Monday afternoon with papers to prevent further execution of the writ of assistance, and he was accompanied by 160 men under the supervision of Master Mechanic Blackall. They arrived in Bainbridge late that evening, and the engine and cars were switched to a sidetrack. The 2 parties faced off on Tuesday morning at the tunnel. 350 Erie guerrillas headed toward the tunnel. By evening, it was estimated that there were 700 to 800 Erie men with revolvers at the south end of the tunnel, and about 400 Albany and Susquehanna men at the north end of the tunnel. The Erie men entered the tunnel with an engine, and on a curve they met the Albany and Susquehanna engine. The engines crashed. The Erie engine backed out and had lost a headlight, 1 flagstaff, and part of a cowcatcher. The Albany and Susquehanna engine was partially off the track and had lost most of its brow. It backed out through the tunnel, and both men from the trains rushed each other. Out of the tunnel, the brawl resumed. Threats, cries, and horrible oaths were intermingled so as to be quite unintelligible except as to their hideousness and profanity. Some of the men were drunk. Surprising, right? Erie suffered the most injuries. 2 men were shot, but not seriously, and 1 man had a skull fracture, which you would think that would be kind of serious, but I guess they didn't think it was. Erie party took 1 Albany man as a prisoner, and they threatened to kill him. He escaped about 11:30, but wandered about till the next morning. The 44th Regiment had arrived about 8 p.m. Colonel Roby ordered men into formation, and once the drum started, the Albany men had fled back through the tunnel. Even Governor Hoffman came. He came about 10 p.m. This was really quite the big excitement down there. He telegraphed sheriffs along the route, the military should not interfere except it is absolutely necessary for the preservation of public order. If the interruption to the public travel continues and tumult, riot, and resistance to authority are imminent, I will declare the whole district affected to be in a state of insurrection and will take position and control of the road. And to that end, if necessary, we'll call out the whole military force of the state. Well, both parties met in the executive chamber on Wednesdays to try to work things out. And while there, Mr. Prine and Mr. Ramsey were arrested by the Albany County Sheriff on contempt of court based on an order by Judge Bernard. A writ of habeas corpus was obtained immediately from Judge Clue, and the parties were taken to his office. There was also a warrant for Mr. Van Valkenburg at the Albany and Susquehanna office, which was heavily guarded, and there were so many men on the balcony that it actually collapsed, which injured several of them seriously, including Mr. Ramsey's son. Mr. Van Valkenburg was then arrested by the sheriff when he was leaving the office. And Bernard's attachment was that the men were to appear before him the very next day in New York City. The charge was for not letting Fisk and Quarter into the office and for taking possession of the road. Well, the men argued for them. They claimed the return due Judge Bernard showed no cause why they should be further detained. Prine, Van Valkenburg, and Ramsey were sworn. They claimed they were acting on the order of the Supreme Court in regard to possession of the road, and the judge decided to put off a decision until the next day. Well, that wasn't going to work if they had to be before Bernard the next morning. So, that didn't make Mr. Hadley, who was the lawyer for Albany County Sheriff, very happy, because Sheriff Parr could now be charged with contempt if he did not produce the men as required by Judge Bernard. So the judge ordered John Malloy to take charge of Mr. Ramsey, sheriff deputies to take charge of Mr. Prine and Mr. Van Valkenburg. Mr. Hadley objected to that also, and he said they should either be released or remain in custody of the sheriff. The judge disagreed, and the men walked out with their keepers. So a lot of people really weren't listening too much to Judge Bernard. Governor Hoffman then appointed Brevet Major General James McQuaid as superintendent of the road. I appoint you until otherwise ordered superintendent of the Albany and Susquehanna Road. You will proceed at once along the line of the road and make arrangements for the immediate running of regular trains for public accommodation. Use your discretion in the employment of assistants and subordinates and report all of your proceedings for approval. Well, the Lockport Daily Courier, I mean, it's got to be news all over the state. So here it is, Lockport working on this. It reprinted an article the New York Herald had. Altogether, it is the most magnificent, entertaining, and distracting muddle of modern times. It is better than the anti-rent war, 50 times better than Grant's visit to Long Branch. The confusion of the thing is so beautiful. It is so exquisitely incomprehensible. This indeed is, critically speaking, the great point. All ordinary uproars are soon seen through. We knew them as we know the incidents of a ride in a city horse car, and it is this familiarity that breeds contempt for them as commonplaces. We defy anybody to have a similar contempt for Fisk's doings. He means to be sublime by keeping just in the outer limits of popular comprehension. So if you're confused by what's going on, so were they. Anyway, Prine, Ramsey, and Van Valkenburg were discharged by Judge Clute. They had been acting under appointment of the New York State Supreme Court, and the court could not punish its own servants. Things calmed down by Thursday, August 12th. General McQuaid went to Binghamton. The road was mostly in good condition. The trestle bridge between Afton and Harpersville was still impassable. And the trestle bridge between Harpersville and the tunnel had been partially destroyed. Now, I don't know if this was between the tunnel. This is a neat bridge. I ran across this coming back up Route 7. Obviously, it's not the original bridge. But anyway, it's one of those bridges that had problems. Rails removed from the bridge 2 miles from the tunnel. It believed the trains could start running on Saturday morning. Nothing now remains but the completion of the 2 trestle bridges to replace the road in status quo antebellum. A short proceeding was held on Tuesday, August 31st before Judge Hocheboom at Albany. The issue was the location of where those books were. Mr. Smith admitted the books were at his house by this time in the proper custody of those entitled to control them, obviously the Ramsey party. Mr. Field for the Fisk party asked that Judge Peckham's order appointing Mr. Prine be vacated, as well as the injunction restraining Fisk and Quarter as receivers. Judge Hocheboom said he needed to make time to make that decision, but he did dissolve Judge Peckham's injunction preventing the Fisk party from instituting proceedings for the recovery of the books. So So the Fisk directors met on the evening of September 3rd to start proceedings for the return of the books. They resolved that Field and Shearman be employed as counsel to take all the legal means for the recovery and restoration of the said books and for the arrest and punishment of the persons abstracting them. And further resolved that the books, as soon as recovered, be deposited in the office of this company to be kept there with the other books of the company. They then had another meeting at the Delavan House on September 6th, and that was where they planned to meet the next day's stockholders meetings. They wrote 3 resolutions, one for 11:45 a.m., one for noon, and the third one denouncing Mr. Ramsey. Mr. Morgan, who was the attorney, went to Judge Bernard House in New York City to get a warrant for the arrest of Ramsey, Phelps, and Henry Smith for taking the books from the office. Well, that same evening, suddenly the books were back in the office. Wilbur Ramsey and Phelps, they slipped the books back up with a basket and a rope through a back window. So the books were there, so kind of made the complaint moot. On Monday, though, the day of the election, 2 gangs of ruffians arrived in Albany from New York City to act as proxies for the voting stockholders. At least one man without one leg to his breeches, and many others with their breeches rolled up and without stockings, and others with their breasts and whole upper part of their persons exposed. Another person described 3 as having blackened eyes and some with their arms in slings. Mangum hired a room and stamped the men's proxies. The Fisk party planned arrangement of room to hold exactly 103 people. Between the roughs, the Erie personnel, Opera House personnel, the number came to 99. So that meant there were only 4 seats left in the entire room for legitimate stockholders. But that still wasn't enough. They had to make sure every little last detail was under control. So now they needed to control the timing. Now back then there was no standard time. There was no standard time until November 18th, 1883, when there were 4 time zones were set up. And this was not officially adopted by the federal government until 1918, believe it or not. So anyway, the Fisk party sent a man up to the Dudley Observatory, and he was to meet with the man up there to set the time. He came back and they all adjusted their watches to his time. And this was 4 minutes ahead of what was the local Albany time. The arrest warrants had been signed by Judge Bernard, were given to the Albany sheriff on the morning of the election, and he was told, "Sheriff, do your duty." One warrant was ordered Parr to bring Mr. Prine to New York City before Judge Bernard. He was a little concerned about this, and he went to see his attorney, Mr. Hadley, but he was told that if he found the man at the stockholders meeting, he had to arrest him. So as the Erie party passed the resolution, the sheriff arrived to arrest Ramsey and Smith. Smith would later testify, "I didn't care one straw for myself at that time, but when I saw Mr. Ramsey there struggling against a band of men like those, knowing that the whole of his fortune, the work and the achievements of a lifetime was in the scale, when I saw this man in charge of the sheriff and held there as a prisoner just as this election was to be proceeded with, I felt that if I had not been a man slow to anger, something would have happened." But Mr. Parr did have a deputy with him who helped him fill out the bonds, and Mr. Ramsey provided the bonds, and the men were released. At noon, the Fisk inspectors started to receive their ballots. At 12:02, Judge Allen protested on behalf of the Ramsey party, but they kept counting. At 12:16, they were served with another injunction, but most of the votes had already been counted at that point. And they declared the meeting closed at 1 p.m. They claimed that they had voted 13,400 shares of stock for the Fisk party. And the prearranged directors, Colonel Church being the president, were elected, and they then demanded control of the railroad. Well, the Ramsey folks, they obviously couldn't get into the boardroom because there was only seats for 4 people. So they gathered in the stateroom, and they passed several of their own resolutions, one of them which was condemning Fisk and Gould. And as they started counting, ballots they were served with an injunction restraining them from receiving 9,500 shares of stock. A member of the Fisk party stood next to the desk where counting was going on and objected to every ballot. And they also said that voting past 1 p.m. was invalid, and they ignored it and counted until 3:18 that afternoon. Well, the governor refused to turn the railroad over to either party. He telegraphed the Attorney General to bring suit in the name of the people in the Rochester District Court, and the road remained in the custody of Colonel Banks. There was a trial in Rochester, which was certainly out of this area where all this had been taking place, on December 1st. And the Fisk party made a motion to have the complaint dismissed because they didn't feel the court had jurisdiction. The Judge Smith, he disagreed. They next had a motion for a jury trial, and he denied this as well. And then it went on. Both sides started giving the history of the conflict. It wasn't until December 13th that Mr. Smith pleaded the case for the Ramsey. He intended to show that what has been called here the church election was a wanton and intentional violation of the law and was intended to be the consummation of a scheme long before that conceived, in the hope that by that day's work they could seize the millions of property which belonged to the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad Company and its stockholders and convert it to their own dishonest purposes. Judge Darwin Smith gave his decision on December 31st. He declared that the Ramsey directors were legally elected. He based this on several factors. The Ramsey Board of Directors was legal and valid. The fact that the election opened at 12 p.m. was legal. The fact that it continued after 1 p.m. was not unlawful. And it was not improper for the inspectors to keep it open as long within a reasonable discretion as was necessary to receive the votes of all the stockholders present, ready, and offering to vote. On the other hand, the election held by Hamilton, Harris, and others was not a legal and valid election. It is also clearly established and undisputed that the stockholders meeting was called to order and organized about 15 minutes before 12 o'clock. The notice for the election time was fixed at 12 o'clock noon. I think there can be no doubt that there was surprise and fraud upon many stockholders and against such stockholders as did not participate in such meetings were irregular and void. There was a discrepancy between the time kept at the company's ticket office and the time of the watches of those at the stockholder meetings in which Mr. Church provided. I think it quite evident that the reorganization was moved at least 3 minutes before 12 o'clock by the time in the treasurer and tickets office of the company, which I think was more to be relied on as the true time in the city of Albany. And he went on, the ex parte appointment of receiver by Judge Bernard must have been granted incautiously and upon some mistake in oral representation or statement of the facts, as it was clear conflict with the law. And as to packing the room with ruffians, the importation and crowding into a small space of such a class of men as I have described and furnished them with proxies was a gross perversion and abuse of the right to vote by proxy and a clear infringement on the rights of bona fide stockholders of the company. And I am accordingly forced to find, as a matter of fact and of law, that the election held by Hamilton Harris, Joseph Bush, and James Oliver, acting inspections, was therefore irregular, fraudulent, and void. Judgment, therefore, be given judging that the Fisk set of directors were not duly elected and that the Ramsey set were duly elected and are the legal and lawful directors of said corporation. And it will be further ordered that the said directors, so held to be duly elected, be let immediate possession of said railroad and receive transfer to them of all property and assets in his hands belonging to said corporation. My duty is now discharged. If I had erred in judgment or opinion, the error is not irreversible. And of course, that left it open for the Fisk party to appeal the decision, which they did on February 2nd to set aside Judge Smith's ruling. Well, I think the A&S decided that there was a better option here, and so they decided on February 24th to lease the A&S Railroad to the Delaware and Hudson Railroad for 99 years. It would still be run by the Ramsey directors, but the name would be changed to the Delaware and Hudson Coal Company, Albany and Susquehanna Railroad Department. And the Delaware and Hudson planned to make the road one of the best equipped and most completely appointed passenger roads running out of Albany. They will make liberal expenditures to accomplish this purpose. They have already given orders to this effect. They propose to do all that the Erie Company contemplated to make it a through line and at the same time meet all the requirements of local traffic. Well, James Fisk was murdered on January 2nd, 1872, with a love triangle, and the other man that was in love with Josephine shot him. He only got 4 years for it. It was considered manslaughter, so I thought that was pretty interesting. And Judge Bernard, for all of his rotten dealings, he was impeached at a trial in Saratoga in 1872. I think there were 38 charges against him. They weren't all for the A&S. He was, fooling around with other railroads as well, but he definitely was impeached in 1872. It really didn't end the court cases. As it turned out, Judge Smith had done some things rather inappropriate, and his rulings was overturned in 1874. It was claimed that his court did not have jurisdiction, and who the rightful directors were should have been decided by a jury, which he said a jury was not needed. A new trial was needed, but I have not been able to find anything after that as to what happened. So I don't know if it was just left go or what, but I couldn't find any more about whether they had another trial. Anyway, the Albany and Binghamton passenger trains ran until their discontinuance in 1962. The line was then sold to Canadian Pacific in 1990. In 2000, Canadian Pacific, which bought the Delaware and Hudson Railroad Company in 1990, decided that rather than maintaining a railroad bridge over the Normanskill, it would just abandon the line. And in the winter of 2010, Albany County purchased the trail for $700,000 with support from Scenic Hudson and a grant from the New York State Office of Parks and Recreation. And in 2023, they replaced the D&H bridge with a new bridge, and before it was replaced, the thing buckled. Now, I have to laugh at this because I had worked for Mohawk Hudson Land Conservatory when we were doing a lot of work with this rail trail, and I don't know how many meetings I had with the county officials, and they didn't want people walking on that old railroad bridge because all it was going to take was one other truck to hit it, and all those people would get killed on the bridge. And I kept thinking, oh, give me a break. This thing was built to hold locomotives. A few people walking on it, even if another truck hit it. So I just have to laugh when they took it down and they put this silly little bridge up, and it wasn't even finished before the silly thing buckled. So. Anyway, so it's been replaced with a temporary, which I now understand is a permanent bridge, and it does complete the 10 miles that make up the Albany County Helderberg Hudson Trail, and that adds to the long history of the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad. So now you know the story. So, any questions? Well, thank you. If there's no questions, thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoyed it. I mean, if you know any other organization that would be interested in having the presentation, let me know. I mean, I'm more than happy to give it again to other places. So, thank you.